What if the loneliest moment of your life is not a punishment, but an initiation? What if everything you are terrified of losing is exactly what is preventing you from discovering who you are? Stay with this until the end, because the truth revealed at the climax of this speech may explain why your pain has been repeating, and how solitude becomes the doorway to your most powerful self. There is a moment that arrives without announcement. It does not come crashing like a storm. It comes quietly, almost politely, as if asking permission to enter your life. One day you notice the messages slow down, the laughter fades, the faces that once mirrored your existence are no longer there to confirm it, and suddenly, without warning, you are left alone with yourself. Not the version of yourself you present, but the one you have been carefully avoiding. This moment feels unsettling not because of silence, but because of what the silence exposes. For the first time there is no audience, no one to adjust your words for, no one to impress, reassure, or disappoint. And in that stillness, a question begins to pulse beneath your thoughts, persistent and uncomfortable. If everything external falls away, what remains of you? Most people have never met themselves without witnesses. From the beginning, survival taught you to adapt. You learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to smile, when to hide. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your personality became a negotiation, a trade between who you are and what keeps you accepted. Over time, this trade feels normal, necessary, even virtuous, until the structures that supported it vanish. Losing people feels like losing parts of your body because those people carried fragments of your identity. With them, you were someone specific, reliable, strong, needed, desired. Without them, those labels dissolve and the mind panics. It searches for replacements. It asks whether you failed, whether you are broken, whether you are unlovable. But beneath these questions lies a deeper fear, one rarely spoken aloud. Without others, you may have no defined shape at all. This is why the initial encounter with isolation feels like a psychological rupture. The self you constructed through relationships collapses, and the ego resists fiercely. It tells you to distract yourself, to rebuild quickly, to find new attachments before the emptiness becomes unbearable. But the emptiness is not a void, it is an unopened room. Here, in this early stage, discomfort is often mistaken for danger. The nervous system interprets solitude as rejection and rejection as extinction. Ancient instincts awaken. The body tightens. The mind rehearses memories and imagined futures, searching desperately for proof that you still exist. Yet existence does not require witnesses. Identity does not require agreement. What makes this phase so powerful is that it cannot be rushed without consequence. Any attempt to prematurely escape it only recreates the same patterns that led here. This is the threshold where the familiar dies, but the new has not yet been named. A liminal space where certainty dissolves and meaning has not yet formed. At this point, many turn back. They reattach to roles that no longer fit, return to dynamics that once felt safe, accept identities that shrink them, not because those identities are true, but because they are known. The unknown self is far more frightening than the false one. Yet if you remain here even briefly, something subtle begins to happen. Beneath the anxiety, beneath the grief of separation, another sensation emerges. A raw awareness, a noticing. You begin to observe thoughts instead of performing them. You feel emotions without explaining them. You start to sense impulses that were long suppressed, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. This is the beginning of confrontation, not with the world, but with the inner architecture that shaped your life choices. You realize how often you bent, softened, silenced, or exaggerated yourself to maintain connection. You see how belonging became a substitute for authenticity. And in that realization, the pain of loss transforms into something sharper, more honest, more demanding. Human beings do not cling to others merely for companionship. They cling because connection provides structure to the self. From early life, identity is assembled through reflection. You learn who you are by how you are received. A smile reinforces one aspect of you, disapproval suppresses another. Long before conscious choice, the psyche begins to map safety onto approval and danger onto isolation. What begins as adaptation slowly becomes dependence. Belonging feels like oxygen because it regulates uncertainty. When others are present, reality feels confirmed. Your thoughts feel validated. Your emotions feel permitted. Your existence feels anchored. Without this feedback loop, the mind drifts. It questions its own legitimacy. This is why the fear of losing people is rarely about losing love alone. It is about losing orientation. Without familiar relationships, the internal compass spins without direction. Over time, this dependence on external reference points grows more sophisticated. You do not merely seek presence, you seek roles. Friend, partner, provider, leader, helper, outsider. Each role carries expectations, and with them, a sense of purpose. Purpose in this form is not discovered but assigned. It is efficient, comforting, and fragile. When the relationship dissolves, the role dissolves with it, leaving behind an unsettling vacancy. To avoid this vacancy, many learn anticipate rejection before it occurs. They refine themselves strategically. Tone is adjusted, opinions are filtered, needs are minimized. The self becomes modular, rearranged according to context. This adaptation is praised as maturity or social intelligence, but beneath it lies a quiet self-betrayal. You begin to confuse being accepted with being known. The reason losing others feels unbearable is not because solitude is inherently painful, but because solitude removes the mirrors that allowed you to recognize yourself. When those mirrors disappear, you are forced to confront how much of your identity existed only in reflection. The shock is not emptiness itself, but the realization that the fullness you felt was borrowed. This borrowed fullness often masks an inner avoidance. As long as others are present, attention remains outward. Conflicts can be displaced. Dissatisfaction can be rationalized. Unexamined impulses can remain dormant. Relationships become containers not only for intimacy, but for unconscious material you are not yet ready to face. When the container breaks, its contents spill inward. This is why periods of loss often coincide with heightened anxiety, rumination, or restlessness. The psyche, deprived of external occupation, turns inward with intensity. What was once diffused across interactions now demands direct engagement. Old memories resurface, unlived desires reappear. Contradictions long ignored rise into awareness. The mind struggles because it has been trained to regulate itself through others, not through inner coherence. In this context, attachment is less about love and more about regulation. Others stabilize your nervous system. They confirm your value, distract from your doubts, and soften the confrontation with your own depths. When they are gone, you are left without the familiar mechanisms that kept your inner world balanced. The resulting instability is not a flaw, but a signal that internal structures have been underdeveloped. Society often misinterprets this phase as weakness or failure. Productivity declines, certainty dissolves, motivation fluctuates. But what is actually occurring is a reorganization. The psyche is attempting to shift from external regulation to internal alignment. This process is uncomfortable because it dismantles shortcuts that once made life manageable. The discomfort intensifies when you realize how early this pattern began, how approval shaped expression, how love became conditional, how certain traits were amplified while others were buried. You begin to see that much of what you called personality was adaptation refined over time, not false in intention but incomplete in truth. When this understanding surfaces, it challenges deeply held beliefs about connection. It forces a reckoning with the cost of constant adjustment. It reveals how often you chose belonging over integrity, harmony over honesty, acceptance over wholeness. And in that recognition, the context of loss changes from random misfortune to psychological necessity. As the external structures fall away, what collapses first is not strength, but illusion. The illusion that identity is stable, that character is fixed, that the self you present is the self you are. When relationships dissolve, routines break, and validation disappears, the carefully maintained narrative of who you are begins to fracture. This fracture is experienced as confusion. You wake up unsure of your direction, your preferences feel unfamiliar, your motivations lose clarity. What once felt natural now feels rehearsed, and what once energized you now feels hollow. This stage is marked by resistance. The mind attempts to restore the previous order by force. It revisits old identities, exaggerates former achievements, clings to memories as evidence of worth. It may even recreate familiar conflicts simply to feel recognizable pain. Suffering, when known, feels safer than uncertainty. But no matter how fiercely the psyche resists, the old framework cannot be rebuilt in the same way. The collapse occurred because it no longer fit the growing complexity within you. As the false self deteriorates, discomfort intensifies. You may feel irritable without cause, restless without direction, emotional without narrative. This is because the structures that once organized your inner world are no longer functional. The roles you played provided not only social stability but psychological containment. Without them, emotions are no longer filtered through performance. They surface raw, unpolished, and often contradictory. In this phase, the inner critic becomes louder. It accuses you of regression, weakness, failure. It urges productivity, reinvention, visibility. But beneath this pressure is fear. Fear that without structure you will dissolve. Fear that without definition you will become nothing. This fear is ancient. It stems from early experiences where belonging was necessary for survival. The psyche learned to equate structure with safety, even when that structure required self-erasure. As this internal tension escalates, the boundary between conscious intention and unconscious material thins. Dreams become vivid, memories intrude without invitation. Old wounds reassert themselves with emotional charge. This is not random disturbance, it is the psyche reclaiming disowned fragments. The parts of you that were suppressed to maintain coherence are returning because coherence has already been lost. This is the progression into confrontation. You begin to see patterns that once felt inevitable, why certain relationships repeated, why certain conflicts persisted, why fulfillment always felt slightly out of reach. The narrative shifts from external blame to internal recognition, not in self-accusation but in clarity. You realize how much of your life was shaped by avoidance of rejection, of conflict, of disappointment, of solitude. This realization is destabilizing because it removes the comfort of innocence. You can no longer believe that life simply happened to you. You begin to see how often you collaborated with what limited you, how often you silenced instinct in favor of acceptance, how often you chose familiarity over truth. This awareness does not liberate immediately. It weighs heavily. Responsibility feels heavier than victimhood. As the collapse deepens, isolation becomes more pronounced. Not just socially, but internally. You no longer feel aligned with your past, yet the future remains undefined. You exist in suspension, between identities. This is the threshold most people attempt to escape. They numb it, distract from it, intellectualize it. But if you do not escape, if you allow the disintegration to continue, it reaches a point of total surrender. This is where the experience shifts from discomfort to existential exposure. There is a moment when the effort to reconstruct fails completely. The strategies no longer work. The distractions lose effectiveness. The mind exhausts itself trying to regain control. What remains is bare awareness. No explanation, no story, no defense. This is the psychological descent often mistaken for despair. It feels like emptiness, but it is not hollow. It is unstructured. You are no longer propped up by identity, belief, or role. You are simply present with yourself. The fear here is profound because nothing stands between you and your own interior. No label protects you, no expectation guides you. You confront the raw fact of being. In this state, time feels distorted. Days lose distinction. Motivation becomes inconsistent. You may feel invisible even to yourself. Yet beneath this numbness, something subtle is occurring. The psyche is no longer expending energy maintaining a false configuration. The tension that once held everything together releases. This release feels like collapse, but it is also relief. As the noise recedes, perception sharpens. You begin to notice sensations that were previously drowned out. Emotional nuances, bodily responses, intuitive signals. Without the pressure to perform, attention turns inward. You begin to observe thoughts instead of obeying them. Emotions arise and pass without immediate justification. This is not control, it is presence. Here, the self is no longer defined by reaction. You are not responding to expectation or resisting judgment. You are encountering yourself without mediation. This encounter is uncomfortable because it lacks familiarity. There is no script, but there is honesty. You begin to recognize desires that do not serve approval, values that do not align with praise, limits that were previously ignored. This confrontation often feels like death because it dissolves continuity. The story of who you thought you were ends here, not dramatically but quietly. There is no ceremony, no witness, just the recognition that the identity you defended no longer exists. And with that recognition comes grief, not for people alone, but for the self you invested in becoming. Grief, in this context, is not weakness. It is acknowledgement. You mourn the years spent contorting, the instincts suppressed, the truths postponed. You mourn the safety you believed you had. This grief deepens the silence. But within this silence, something authentic begins to organize, not as an idea, but as a sensation of alignment. You feel when something resonates or recoils. You notice what drains you and what steadies you. Meaning no longer arrives from affirmation but from coherence. You are not yet whole, not yet defined, but you are no longer fragmented. This is the paradox of the darkest point. Nothing has been rebuilt, yet something essential has been recovered. Not confidence, not certainty, but contact. Contact with a self that does not require performance to exist. A self that remains when everything else is stripped away. What emerges after the descent is not a sudden transformation, but a quiet reorientation. There is no dramatic revelation, no moment where everything makes sense at once. Instead, there is a subtle shift in how you inhabit yourself. You notice that your reactions slow down. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself immediately. Silence becomes tolerable, even informative. The absence that once felt threatening now feels spacious, as though something essential has finally been given room to breathe. You begin to recognize yourself not through how you are received, but through how you respond internally. Choices are no longer measured by approval alone, but by the tension or ease they produce within you. When something is misaligned, you feel it immediately, not as anxiety, but as contraction. When something is true, it carries a quiet steadiness, even if it brings discomfort. This internal feedback becomes more reliable than external affirmation ever was. The self that forms here is not constructed, it is uncovered. It is composed less of traits and more of orientation. You are not defining who you are for others, but discovering what you can no longer betray within yourself. Integrity replaces image. Coherence replaces performance. You begin to understand that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the refusal to abandon yourself when vulnerability appears. Relationships are perceived differently now. You see how often connection was used to escape yourself, how intimacy was confused with distraction, how closeness sometimes served as anesthesia. This awareness does not harden you, it refines you. You become more selective, not out of fear but out of clarity. You recognize that not every connection deserves access to your inner world, and that depth cannot exist where honesty is not welcomed. With this clarity comes restraint. You no longer rush to fill space with words. You allow pauses. You allow misunderstandings to reveal themselves rather than correcting them instantly. You notice that some people are drawn to the new quiet in you while others become uncomfortable. Not because you have changed dramatically, but because you are no longer contorting to maintain equilibrium. You are steady, and steadiness exposes instability in others. This phase is often mistaken for detachment, but it is not withdrawal from life. It is participation without self-erasure. You are present without being consumed. You care without dissolving. You give without abandoning your limits. The energy once spent managing perception is now available for discernment. You listen more deeply, not to respond, but to understand. You speak less, but with greater precision. Meaning begins to form not as an abstract philosophy, but as lived alignment. You find yourself drawn to activities that require presence rather than performance. Work that demands integrity, conversations that tolerate complexity, solitude that is chosen, not endured. You begin to trust your internal rhythm, even when it diverges from collective expectations. You accept that your pace may appear slow to others, but it is accurate to you. The temptation to revert does not disappear. Familiar patterns still call to you, especially in moments of fatigue or uncertainty. There are times when the old strategies promise relief. Approval still soothes, distraction still works temporarily, but now there is awareness. You see the cost immediately, you feel the dissonance, and because you have tasted alignment, the trade no longer feels worthwhile. Moving forward requires a defer, NT kind of discipline. Not the discipline of control, but the discipline of attention. You must remain attentive to the subtle ways you are invited to abandon yourself again. The invitations are rarely obvious. They come disguised as opportunity, harmony, success, or love. They ask you to compromise just a little, to silence something small, to postpone a truth for the sake of comfort. Here, discernment becomes essential. You learn to pause before agreeing, to notice your body before committing, to question urgency. You recognize that anything demanding immediate self-betrayal is not aligned, no matter how attractive it appears. You begin to trust discomfort when it signals honesty and to question ease when it requires denial. This approach to life changes how you experience difficulty. Challenges no longer feel like threats to identity, because identity is no longer dependent on outcome. Failure does not collapse you. Criticism does not define you. Loss, while painful, no longer erases you. You understand that what you have found cannot be taken by circumstance, because it was not given by circumstance. Connection, when it returns, feels different. It is slower, less dramatic, more mutual. You do not rush to be understood. You allow others to meet you where you are, or not at all. There is space for difference without collapse. Conflict becomes informative rather than destabilizing. You are no longer fighting to be seen, you are choosing whether to see. You also begin to recognize when solitude is necessary, not as retreat, but as recalibration. You no longer interpret time alone as failure. You see it as maintenance, a way to listen again, a way to clear the noise that inevitably accumulates through engagement. Solitude becomes a resource, not a sentence. The future is approached with humility rather than certainty. You no longer need to know exactly who you will become. You trust the process of alignment more than the promise of arrival. You understand that the self is not a destination, but a relationship, one that requires ongoing attention, honesty, and courage. You move forward not with the need to prove, but with the willingness to respond. You allow life to meet you rather than trying to dominate it. You accept that some doors will remain closed, not as punishment, but as protection. You stop interpreting every ending as rejection and begin to see how many endings were necessary to remove what was no longer true. What you have found is not immunity to pain, but resilience rooted in coherence. You still feel loss, but it does not dismantle you. You still desire connection, but it does not consume you. You still experience fear, but it does not command you. The center holds. And from this center, action becomes simpler. You choose what aligns, you decline what fragments, you speak when silence would betray you. You remain silent when speech would be performance. You allow yourself to be misunderstood rather than misrepresented. You accept that not everyone will recognize the version of you that no longer performs for recognition. This way of living requires continual return. There is no permanent state, only repeated commitment. Each day presents new opportunities to abandon yourself or to remain. Each interaction tests your coherence. Each choice reveals what you value. The work is ongoing, quiet, often invisible, but it is real. And once you have experienced this reality, the cost of losing it becomes too high to ignore. Even when the world offers you comfort in exchange for your absence, even when familiarity tempts you to step back into old shapes, even when loneliness whispers that it would be easier to disappear into others again, even when uncertainty presses and the urge to outsource your sense of self returns, you recognize the subtle tightening that signals departure from alignment. You pause, you breathe, you remain, because what you found in the absence of everyone else is no longer negotiable, and moving forward now means carrying that presence into every decision, every relationship, every silence, knowing that the self you recovered does not demand perfection, only participation, and that staying with it is not an achievement, but a practice that continues each time you choose not to abandon what you have finally learned to hear within yourself.